Jack Thornton had sworn off women, love, and every damn curse that came with opening your heart to another soul. But on that scorching Nevada desert night when he opened his door, everything he'd built to protect himself was about to be destroyed in a single moment. When he heard that desperate scream cutting through the desert silence, Jack set down his whiskey bottle and walked to the door. There, collapsed on the wooden porch steps, was a woman in a white wedding dress stained with blood and desert dirt. The silk fabric had turned grayish, torn lace trailing behind like the remnants of shattered dreams. He stood frozen, the warm bottle still in his hands as he stared at this stranger woman, someone who had appeared from nowhere on one of Nevada's worst nights. 15 years, no soul had set foot on this land, and now here was a bride. God had one hell of a twisted sense of humor. For a moment he thought she might be dead, just another casualty the world had dumped on his doorstep to test what humanity he had left. But as he got closer, he could see she was breathing. Shallow, labored breaths in the desert cold. Dark hair was plastered to her face, but he could still make out beautiful features. Exhaustion and fear had infected this face. He recognized that look of fear, the same expression he'd seen in his own mirror, the night he found his wife in another man's arms at the saloon. "Ma'am," his voice came out rougher than expected, rusty from disuse. No response. She'd passed out and the situation was getting worse. Horse hooves could be heard in the distance, torches scanning the desert. Jack looked at his cabin, warm, dry, and safe. Everything he'd built to keep the world outside. Then he looked at this mysterious woman across from him. Somehow she'd made it to the one place that was supposed to be kept away from heartbreak and complications. He could leave her there, go back inside and finish his whiskey, pretend he'd never seen her. By morning she'd either be gone or dead. Either way, his peace would remain intact. But then he saw something that made his stomach turn. On her left wrist, under the blood and mud-stained fabric, there were bruises, finger-shaped marks. This told a story he knew from his sheriff days, from the time when he believed in protecting people. Someone had hurt her, and she'd run so far that she'd ended up here, at the edge of nowhere, in a wedding dress that now looked like a shroud. Jack cursed under his breath, and picked her up in his arms. Despite being soaked, he was surprised how light she was. As he carried her to the door, her head leaned against his shoulder, and he saw her face in the porch light. She was beautiful, the kind of beautiful that would once make him believe in forever. And that scared him more than any desert storm ever could. He kicked open the door and stepped inside. Water from both of them dripping onto the wooden floor he'd carefully maintained for 15 years. He laid her on the couch where he'd spent countless nights trying to convince himself he was better off alone. The woman stirred slightly. Her eyes fluttered open for just a moment, green eyes widening with confusion and maybe relief. She tried to speak, lips moving soundlessly, but then consciousness slipped away again. But in that brief moment, something tightened Jack's chest with a feeling he'd been trying to forget for 10 years. Hope, and he realized that whatever had brought this woman to his door in a ruined wedding dress wasn't just going to change her life. It was going to shatter the carefully constructed walls around his heart and force him to remember what it felt like to care about someone other than himself. The question was, would he be strong enough to survive it this time? 3 hours later, when Sarah woke up, the first thing she saw was a pair of steel-gray eyes watching her from across the room. The second thing she noticed was that she was no longer wearing her wedding dress. Panic shot through her body like lightning. She bolted upright on the unfamiliar couch, clutching the rough wool blanket to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs. The room spun slightly. Wooden walls, a crackling fireplace, the smell of coffee. "Easy." The man's voice was calm, steady. He sat in a chair by the window, hands clasped in front of him, making no move to approach her. "You're safe." Safe. The word felt foreign in her mouth. She hadn't been safe for months, maybe years. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for exits, for weapons, for any sign of the men who had been chasing her through the storm. Where am I?" Her voice came out barely a whisper, throat raw from crying and screaming into the desert wind. "My ranch, middle of nowhere, which I'm guessing is exactly where you were trying to get to." He tilted his head slightly, studying her face. Name's Jack Thornton. Been living out here alone for about 15 years now. Alone. That explained the careful distance he was keeping. The way he seemed almost uncomfortable having another person in his space. But it also meant no one knew she was here. No one could find her. Your dress was soaked through. Figured you'd rather not freeze to death while unconscious. He gestured toward the fireplace where her wedding gown hung in a steaming line. There's dry clothes on the table there. Used to belong to someone else. That pause told her everything she needed to know about that someone else. Thank you. She meant it. This stranger had saved her life, given her clothes, provided shelter without asking questions. But experience had taught her that kindness always came with a price. What do you want? Something flickered across his face. Surprise. Maybe hurt. Nothing. Storm's still raging out there. When it passes, you can go wherever you were headed. That's when Sarah realized she had nowhere to go. The storm might pass, but the men hunting her wouldn't stop. Her brother's poker debts wouldn't disappear just because she'd fled from the altar. Clayton Voss didn't forgive, and he certainly wouldn't forget someone who'd humiliated him in front of half the town. I can't leave. The words spilled out before she could stop them. They'll find me, drag me back, and this time, she unconsciously touched her wrist, feeling the bruises Clayton had given her when she tried to refuse his marriage proposal. Jack's expression darkened. Who's looking for you? People you don't want to cross. Trust me. She pulled the blanket tighter. I should go. I don't want to bring trouble to your door. Trouble's already at my door. He moved to the window to watch the storm. Lightning illuminated his profile. Strong jaw, weathered skin. The kind of face that had seen too much and learned to expect nothing good from the world. Besides, he added without turning around, haven't had a good reason to use my rifle in years. Might be nice to remember what it feels like to fight for something worth protecting. The way he said it tightened Sarah's chest with something she'd forgotten for so long she almost didn't remember what to call it. But as hope began to bloom in her heart, the sound of horse hooves came from the distance, barely audible over the storm but getting closer. They'd found her. Jack heard them too. His body went rigid at the window. Every muscle coiled like a spring ready to snap. After 15 years of silence, he could recognize the difference between thunder and trouble, and that rhythmic pounding cutting through the storm was definitely the latter. How many? His voice had changed, taking on an edge that hadn't been there moments before. Sarah closed her eyes, listening to the approaching hoofbeats with the practiced ear of someone who'd been running for her life. 4, maybe 5 riders. Clayton doesn't travel light when he's hunting. Clayton. The name came out like a curse. Clayton Voss. Her blood turned to ice. You know him? Jack turned from the window, and the look on his face made her stomach drop. Every lawman from here to San Francisco knows Clayton Voss. Question is, what does a man who owns half the silver mines in Nevada want with a woman in a wedding dress? I was supposed to marry him today. The words tasted like ash in her mouth. My brother owes him money. A lot of money. I was the payment. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling fire and the growing thunder of horses getting closer. Jack stood perfectly still, processing what she'd told him, and Sarah could practically see him weighing his options. Help a stranger and make an enemy of one of the territory's most dangerous men, or hand her over and return to his peaceful isolation. She wouldn't blame him for choosing peace. She'd learned long ago not to expect heroism from men when it might cost them something. There's a root cellar behind the kitchen, he said finally. Hidden door under a rug. You can wait there until they're gone? No. Sarah stood up, clutching the blanket around her like armor. I won't hide while you face them alone. If they find me here, they'll kill you just for giving me shelter. I won't have your blood on my hands, and I won't have yours on mine. He moved to a cabinet near the fireplace, pulling out a rifle that looked well-maintained despite years of disuse. Get to the cellar. That's not a request. The hoofbeats were close enough now that they could hear individual horses' voices calling out commands. Sarah recognized Clayton's voice among them. Calm, controlled, deadly patient. He'd found her trail and followed it here to this sanctuary she'd thought was beyond his reach. "He won't give up," she whispered. "Even if you convince him I'm not here, he'll be back. He'll keep looking until he finds me, whether I want him to or not." Jack was checking his rifle with practiced efficiency, muscle memory from his sheriff years taking over. "Then I guess we'd better make sure that doesn't happen." The knock, when it came, was polite, almost friendly. The kind of knock that said, "We know you're in there and we're willing to be civilized about this for now." "Jack Thornton." Clayton's voice carried easily through the wooden door. "Apologies for the late hour. I'm looking for someone who might have passed this way. A young woman in a wedding dress. She's unwell, needs medical attention." Jack's hand tightened on his rifle. Behind him, Sarah pressed herself against the wall, every instinct screaming at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. The storm had trapped her here, as surely as if she were in a cage. "I'm going to open this door," Jack said quietly, not taking his eyes off the entrance. "When I do, whatever happens next, don't come out of hiding. Promise me." "Jack, I can't let you." "Promise me." The desperation in his voice, the way he said her name like it mattered, like she mattered, broke something inside her chest. "I promise." He moved toward the door, and Sarah realized that in the space of a few hours this stranger had become the only thing standing between her and a fate worse than death, and she was about to watch him risk everything for a woman he barely knew. Jack opened the door just wide enough to step outside, rifle held casually but ready. The storm had lessened to a steady downpour, but the wind still howled through the mountains like something alive and angry. Clayton Voss sat on his horse like he owned the world, which in many ways he did. Tall, well-dressed, even in the rain, with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. Behind him 4 men waited in their saddles, hands resting near their weapons, with the patience of professional killers. "Mr. Thornton." Clayton touched the brim of his hat in mock courtesy. "Beautiful evening for a ride, wouldn't you say?" "Little wet for my taste." Jack kept his voice level, neutral. "What can I do for you, Voss?" "As I mentioned, I'm looking for my bride. Sarah ran away from our wedding today." Understandable, really. Nerves, cold feet, the usual feminine hysteria. "But she's been out in this storm for hours now, and I'm concerned for her health." The way he said bride made Jack's skin crawl, like she was property that had wandered off and needed to be collected. "Haven't seen any women around here. Haven't seen anybody around here for that matter." Clayton's smile widened. "Of course not. But you won't mind if my men take a look around? For her safety, you understand." It wasn't a request. One of the riders, a scarred man with dead eyes, was already dismounting. Jack recognized the type. The kind of man who enjoyed hurting things weaker than himself. "Actually, I do mind." Jack shifted slightly, bringing the rifle into a more obvious position. "This is private property. You want to search it. You'd better have a warrant." "A warrant?" Clayton laughed, the sound cutting through the rain like breaking glass. "My dear fellow, I think you're confused about how things work out here. I own the bank that holds the mortgage on half this valley. I control the water rights to most of the streams. Men like you? Well, let's just say you exist at my pleasure." The scarred man had reached the porch now, water dripping from his coat onto Jack's wooden steps. "Boss says check the house, so I'm checking the house." "No," Jack said quietly, "you're not." The world seemed to pause. Even the storm held its breath as 5 dangerous men realized that the hermit they'd expected to intimidate wasn't going to back down. Clayton's pleasant expression never changed, but something shifted behind his eyes, something cold and calculating that made it clear why he'd become one of the most feared men in the territory. "Mr. Thornton, I don't think you understand the gravity of this situation. My bride is mentally unstable, dangerous even. She attacked me earlier today. You can see the scratches on my face if you look closely. If she's here, she's a threat to your safety." Jack could indeed see the scratches. He could also see what they really were. Defensive wounds from someone fighting for their life. "She's not here," he said again. "Then you won't mind proving it." The scarred man took another step forward, and Jack made a decision that would change everything. He raised the rifle, not quite pointing it at anyone, but making his intentions crystal clear. "I said no. If you were Jack, what would you do? Let them search and hope they don't find Sarah, or risk a gunfight against 5 armed men? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you'd choose, because what Jack decided next would determine whether either of them lived to see morning." The silence stretched like a taut wire. 5 men with guns, 1 hermit with a rifle, and somewhere behind the walls, a woman whose life hung in the balance. Clayton studied Jack with the kind of attention a snake gives a mouse before deciding whether it's worth the effort to strike. The rain continued to fall, but the storm's violence had moved on, leaving behind an almost unnatural quiet. "You know," Clayton said conversationally, settling back in his saddle, "I've heard stories about you, Jack Thornton. Used to be sheriff down in Copper Creek, didn't you? Before you decided to play hermit up here in the mountains." Jack's grip tightened on his rifle. His past wasn't something he discussed, especially not with men like Clayton Voss. "Heard you were quite the lawman. Fair, honest, the kind of man who believed in justice." Clayton's smile turned sharp. "Also heard about why you left. Something about a wife who preferred the company of other men." The words hit like a physical blow. Jack felt 10 years of carefully buried pain surge to the surface, threatening to consume the iron control he'd built around his emotions. Behind him, through the thin cabin walls, he could feel Sarah listening, and that awareness kept him anchored. "Ancient history," he said. "Is it? Because from where I sit, it looks like you're making the same mistake again, risking everything for a woman who will eventually show you her true nature." Clayton leaned forward in his saddle. "Sarah is beautiful, I'll give you that. But she's also a liar, a thief, and thoroughly unstable. The scratches on my face? That was her reaction to a gentle conversation about our future together." Jack had seen enough victims in his time as sheriff to recognize the truth. The scratches on Clayton's face weren't from someone who was unstable. They were from someone fighting for their life. "Like I said, she's not here." Clayton sighed, the sound of a patient man reaching the end of his tolerance. "James." The scarred man stepped forward eagerly, hand moving to his gun. But before he could draw, Jack did something unexpected. He laughed. It was a harsh sound, rusty from disuse, but it cut through the tension like a blade. All 5 men went still, suddenly uncertain. "You want to know what's funny?" Jack said, leveling his rifle at Clayton's chest. 10 years ago, when my wife betrayed me, I thought my life was over. Thought I'd never trust anyone again, never care about anything except surviving from one day to the next. The rifle didn't waver. His voice grew quieter, more dangerous. "But you know what I learned up here in these mountains? Sometimes the things we think will destroy us actually teach us what we're really made of. And right now, looking at you and your hired killers threatening an innocent woman, I'm remembering exactly why I became a lawman in the first place." Clayton's composure cracked slightly. "Mr. Thornton, you're making a very serious mistake." "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make, and if I'm going down, I'm taking you with me." Jack's finger moved to the trigger. The standoff could have lasted seconds or hours. In the end, it was broken by the sound of a horse approaching from the direction of town. A single rider moving fast, despite the muddy conditions. All heads turned as a young man on horseback came into view, wearing a deputy's badge and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "Mr. Voss," the deputy called out, reining in his horse at the edge of the clearing. "Sheriff sent me to find you. Says there's been a development in the Blackwood mine situation. Needs you back in town immediately." Clayton's jaw tightened with frustration, but Jack could see him calculating odds and consequences. Whatever was happening with the mine was apparently more important than continuing this confrontation. "This isn't over, Thornton," Clayton said, gathering his reins. Sarah belongs to me, and I always collect what's mine. She doesn't belong to anyone, Jack replied. And if you come back here, you'd better bring more men. Clayton wheeled his horse around, motioning for his men to follow. As they rode away into the darkness, the deputy lingered for a moment. You might want to consider leaving the territory, Mr. Thornton, he said quietly. Clayton Voss doesn't forgive and he doesn't forget. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. As the last hoofbeats faded into the distance, Jack remained on his porch, rifle still ready, watching the darkness for any sign of movement. Only when he was certain they were truly gone did he allow himself to breathe again. But he knew the deputy was right. Clayton would be back, and next time he'd come prepared for war. Jack stood in the doorway for several minutes after the riders disappeared, letting the rain wash over him as he processed what had just happened. For 15 years he'd avoided exactly this kind of confrontation, this kind of complication. Now he'd just made an enemy of one of the most powerful men in the territory, and all for a woman he'd known for less than a day. When he finally stepped back inside, Sarah was sitting on the couch, still wrapped in the blanket but no longer hiding. Her face was pale, but her green eyes held something he hadn't expected to see. Not gratitude, not relief, but guilt. You should have let him take me, she said quietly. Like hell. Jack, you don't understand what you've done. Clayton doesn't just forget. He'll come back with more men, and then you... I know exactly what I've done. He set the rifle aside and moved to the fireplace, adding another log to keep the flames high. And I know exactly who Clayton Voss is. Sarah studied his face in the firelight, seeing something there that made her stomach clench. There's history between you two. Not directly, but I've cleaned up enough of his messes to know what kind of man he is. Jack's voice carried the weight of old memories, old failures. 3 years ago, when I was still wearing a badge, a young woman came to me, said Clayton was forcing her to marry him to cover her father's debts. I told her to trust the law, that I'd find a way to help her. The silence that followed told Sarah everything she needed to know about how that story ended. What happened to her? Found her body in the river a week later. Officially ruled a suicide. But everyone knew the truth. His hands clenched into fists. I had the evidence to prove Clayton was involved, but somehow it all disappeared from the sheriff's office along with the witness testimonies, and the sheriff got himself a nice new house and suddenly decided he didn't want to pursue the case any further. Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest. She'd known Clayton was dangerous, had seen glimpses of the violence he was capable of, but hearing it confirmed made her realize just how close she'd come to disappearing forever. Why didn't you fight it? You were the law. Jack turned to look at her, and she saw something in his eyes that broke her heart. The look of a man who'd lost faith in everything he'd once believed in. Because I learned that justice isn't about what's right. It's about who has the most money and the most guns. Clayton had both. So you ran away. I survived. The word came out harsher than he'd intended. Same thing you're trying to do. Sarah pulled the blanket tighter around herself, suddenly understanding why this isolated ranch felt so much like a prison. Jack hadn't just been hiding from the world. He'd been hiding from his own failure to protect someone who'd trusted him. The woman who died, she said carefully. What was her name? Mary Henderson. His voice grew quiet. She was 19 years old, had her whole life ahead of her. And you've been carrying that guilt for 3 years. Some things you don't get to put down. Sarah stood up, moving closer to the fire, closer to him. Clayton told me I was lucky to be marrying him. Said most women in my situation didn't get such a generous offer. Most women in your situation end up dead. The brutal honesty of it hit her like a slap. She'd known she was in danger, but hearing someone else say it out loud made it real in a way it hadn't been before. So what do we do? He'll be back. And when he comes, he'll bring enough men to burn this place to the ground if he has to. Jack was quiet for a long moment. staring into the flames as if they might hold answers to questions he'd been asking himself for years. "We have maybe 12 hours before he sorts out whatever crisis pulled him away," he said finally. After that we run." "No." His voice was firm, final. "I'm done running." The way he said it made Sarah's heart race with something that might have been hope or might have been terror. But before she could ask what he meant, they heard something that made both of them freeze. Footsteps on the porch. Jack grabbed his rifle in one fluid motion, motioning for Sarah to get behind the couch. But instead of the harsh knock they'd heard before, this sound was different. Tentative, almost apologetic. "Mr. Thornton," a young voice called through the door. "It's Deputy Morrison. I'm alone." Jack approached the door cautiously, rifle ready. Through the window he could see the same young deputy who'd interrupted the standoff earlier, standing by himself in the rain. "What do you want, Morrison?" "To help, sir, if you'll let me." Jack exchanged a glance with Sarah. This could be a trap, or it could be the first stroke of luck they'd had all night. "You're Clayton's man now," Jack said through the door. "No, sir, I'm the law's man. At least I'm trying to be." Something in the deputy's voice, a mixture of fear and determination, reminded Jack of himself 20 years ago when he'd first pinned on a badge and believed he could make a difference. Against his better judgment, he opened the door. Deputy Morrison was younger than Jack had thought, maybe 25, with a kind of earnest face that hadn't yet learned to hide disappointment. He stepped inside, hat in hand, water dripping from his coat. "Deputy," Jack said carefully, "speak your piece." Morrison glanced at Sarah, who was watching him with wary eyes from behind the couch. "Ma'am, I want you to know that what happened today at the church, not everyone thinks it was right." "What happened at the church?" Jack asked. Morrison looked uncomfortable. "Miss Sarah's brother, Tommy, tried to stop the wedding. Said his sister was being forced into it against her will. Clayton had him beaten unconscious and thrown in jail on charges of disturbing the peace." Sarah gasped, pressing her hand to her mouth. Is Tommy alive?" "Yes, ma'am. But he's hurt bad. Clayton's keeping him locked up until after the situation is resolved." So that was Clayton's insurance policy. Even if Sarah escaped, he still had leverage to bring her back. "Why are you telling us this?" Jack demanded. Morrison straightened his shoulders, looking every inch the lawman he was trying to become. "Because I became a deputy to protect people, not to help rich men collect their property. And because I know what happened to Mary Henderson." The name hit the room like a thunderclap. Jack's expression hardened. "What do you know about Mary?" "I know she didn't kill herself. I know Clayton had her murdered when she refused to marry him." Morrison's voice shook slightly. "And I know Sheriff Bradley destroyed the evidence to protect him. You can't prove any of that." "Maybe not in court, but I was there when they pulled her body from the river. I saw the marks on her throat, the bruises on her wrists. That wasn't suicide, Mr. Thornton. That was murder." Jack felt something shift inside his chest. A door he'd kept locked for 3 years creaking open. "Why didn't you speak up then?" "I was green, scared, figured the sheriff knew what he was doing." Morrison's hands clenched into fists. "I've regretted that silence every day since." Sarah stood up, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. "You said you wanted to help. How?" Morrison reached into his coat and pulled out a badge, a federal marshal star that gleamed even in the dim firelight. "Marshal Williams is on his way from the territorial capital. Should be here by morning. He's been investigating Clayton's operations for months, waiting for the right moment to move." Morrison looked directly at Sarah. "Your testimony about the forced marriage, combined with what happened to Mary, might be enough to finally bring him down." "Might be." Jack's voice was skeptical. "It's more chance than we've had before." Sarah looked between the two men, seeing hope in their faces, but feeling only the weight of impossible choices. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "Clayton doesn't just threaten me. He has my brother. If I testify against him, Tommy's dead either way." Morrison was blunt. "Clayton can't afford to leave witnesses, but if we can get Marshall Williams enough evidence to arrest him, we can save both of you. And if we can't?" The deputy's silence was answer enough. Jack moved to the window, staring out at the darkness where Clayton and his men had disappeared. Somewhere out there, a young man was sitting in a jail cell, beaten and broken because he'd tried to save his sister. And somewhere else, a killer was planning his next move, confident that money and violence would get him everything he wanted, just like 3 years ago when Mary Henderson had trusted the law to protect her. The difference was, this time Jack wasn't gonna let the system fail. "Morrison," he said, turning back to the deputy. "How long until dawn?" "Maybe 4 hours." "And how long until Clayton realizes you're missing?" The young man's face went pale. "Probably about the same." Sarah felt her heart sink. Even if the marshal arrived, even if they had enough evidence, Clayton would never let them live long enough to testify. But as she looked at Jack's face in the firelight, she saw something that made her pulse quicken. He was done running, and he was done letting Clayton Voss destroy innocent lives. The question was whether they could survive what came next. Dawn broke gray and cold over the mountains, painting the sky the color of old steel. Jack stood at his window watching the sun struggle through the clouds when he saw them coming. This time, Clayton hadn't brought just 4 men. A dozen riders approached through the morning mist, spread out in a wide formation that spoke of military precision. They meant to finish this one way or another. "They're here," he said quietly. Sarah joined him at the window, her face pale but determined. She'd changed into the spare clothes he'd given her. Simple pants and a shirt that had once belonged to his wife. Somehow she looked stronger in them, less like a victim and more like a woman ready to fight for her life. "Where's Morrison?" she asked. "Back Ridge. If this goes bad, he'll try to get word to the marshal. And if it goes well?" Jack checked his rifle one last time. "Then we trust that justice still means something in this territory." The rider stopped at the edge of his property, and Clayton dismounted with the casual confidence of a man who'd never lost a fight he couldn't buy his way out of. This time, though, he wasn't smiling. "Thornton," he called out, "we need to talk." Jack stepped onto his porch, Sarah beside him. He could feel her trembling, but she didn't back down. "I'm listening," Jack replied. "Simple trade. The woman for her brother. You hand her over. Tommy goes free. And you get to keep your peaceful little life up here. And if I refuse?" Clayton spread his arms wide, gesturing to the armed men surrounding the cabin. "Then we burn it all down and sort through the ashes for what's left of you." It was then that Sarah did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She stepped forward. "I'll come with you," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "Sarah, no," Jack started. "But I have conditions," she continued, ignoring him. "Tommy goes free, unharmed, and you leave Jack alone forever." Clayton's smile returned. "You're hardly in a position to negotiate, my dear, aren't I?" Sarah's voice grew stronger. "You've already proven you'll kill anyone who gets in your way. Mary Henderson proved that. But if you harm either of them, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of man you really are, even if it's the last thing I do." The mention of Mary's name made Clayton's face darken. "Careful, Sarah. You're walking on dangerous ground. We're all walking on dangerous ground." She took another step forward. "The difference is I'm done being afraid of you." That's when they heard it. The thunder of approaching horses from the opposite direction. But these riders carried something the others didn't. Federal badges that gleamed in the morning sun. Marshal Williams arrived with 6 men, all armed and all wearing the grim expressions of lawmen who'd seen too much corruption go unpunished. "Clayton Voss," the marshal called out, dismounting with practiced efficiency. "You're under arrest for the murder of Mary Henderson, conspiracy to commit murder and human trafficking. You have no proof. Clayton snarled, but his hand was already moving toward his gun. "We have Deputy Morrison's testimony, Miss Sarah's statement about the forced marriage, and a federal investigation that's been building a case against you for months." The marshal's voice was calm, final. "It's over." The gunfight that followed was brief but brutal. Clayton drew first, but Morrison's shot from the ridge was faster. When the smoke cleared, Clayton Voss lay dead in the mud. His empire of fear and violence had finally ended. Sarah collapsed against Jack, the weight of months of terror finally lifting from her shoulders. Tommy was freed that same day, beaten but alive. The marshal's investigation led to the arrest of Sheriff Bradley and the exposure of a corruption network that had protected Clayton for years. As for Jack and Sarah, they discovered that sometimes the most broken people are exactly what each other needs to heal. The rancher who'd lived alone for 15 years found that sharing his life with someone who understood loss and survival made it worth living again. 6 months later, they were married in the same church where Sarah had once fled from a different altar. This time, she walked down the aisle willingly, toward a man who'd proven that love wasn't about possession, but about protection, about choosing to fight for someone, even when it would be easier to walk away. The wedding dress was different, the groom was different, and most importantly, the choice was hers. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. Sometimes the best love stories begin with someone collapsing at your door in the rain. And sometimes the courage to start over comes from realizing that the life you're protecting is worth more than the safety you're clinging to. The rancher was no longer alone, and the bride had finally found someone worth saying yes to. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with a twist so powerful you won't forget it anytime soon.